Welcome to Tools and Tips, solving daily problems using psychology. I'm Dr. Carlos, a behavioral psychologist.
And I am Dr. Ehsan Garajidagi, a clinical psychologist with specialty in addiction.
We're going to look today at what is addiction. We're going to look at all the types of addictions and some of their similarities. So let's get started. Dr. Garajidagi,
Yes.
What is addiction? How would you define that?
Addiction is a habit that we cannot get rid of. In simple terms, let's make it very, very simple so people can understand. And it is a complex habit. It's not a simple habit because most people could just get rid of simple habits. It would be easy. It is so complex that people generally who become so dependent on certain processes or substances that they have a very hard time to just use their strong will to change that habit and behavior. They need a lot more than just strong will. Now, there would be technically, scientifically, more criteria to diagnose someone with addiction. And in fact, there is no diagnosis called addiction. Addiction is just a general term for this type of dependent habitual behavior that people develop. However, there are diagnoses, scientific diagnoses, that are accepted at, let's say, hospitals, clinics, medical offices, psychological offices, called substance use disorder or substance dependence, alcohol dependence, for instance, or other types of dependence. And the reason the word dependence is used is because of very specific behavioral components that come up with dependence, such as if I am dependent on let's say, alcohol, and I stop using alcohol, then I will also go through a very specific and predictable type of what we call withdrawal. And those withdrawal symptoms at times can actually be deadly. Deadly, especially with certain substances. Definitely alcohol is one of them. And anxiolytics, anti-anxiety medication, with alcohol actually kind of fitting very well into this category. As you know, alcohol is one of the substances that helps us relax.
And we're going to be looking at all the nooks and crannies of all these different types of addictions. We're going to get deep into them. Yeah. We're just touching the surface now.
That's right.
A quick question for you. I'm going to take you back a little bit.
Yeah.
It almost seemed like you implied that we don't even have control. We don't.
But we don't. If we are truly dependent, and as a result, going through that addictive behavior, we don't have control. And what I mean by that is we don't have immediate, in the moment control. You know, that the control that people generally would regard as the ability to turn on or turn off a switch for good. To give you an example, an alcoholic, a true alcoholic, at a certain time may decide to stop using, right? And that can happen. They may just make that decision. And then, let's say they stop for a while. They stop for a day. They stop for a week. They stop for a month. But ultimately, through a myriad of different reasons, they find themselves using again. Now, certainly they can blame it on all kinds of stuff, right? They can blame it on society. They can blame it, well, I was offered. And that's the same thing with cigarette smoking. And a lot of people stop smoking, but then they get back to smoking because somebody offered them a cigarette.
Are we going to be looking at that later to see what's the difference between the person who can't stop and the person who stops cold turkey? That sounds like there's a distinction there between those types of...
There is a huge distinction. Yeah. And it has less to do with a simple notion of control and more to do with a plan of action and maintenance and relapse prevention. Because of its complexity, we need a roadmap, a decision that an addictive person would make. I'm going to stop. It's just a decision. It's just a thought, but it's not a roadmap. It's not a plan or map to get somewhere and stay there for a long term. So that's what we will discuss. What's the difference between those individuals who who can actually go beyond the initial decision. They can make the decision, but they're doing something else too. They're creating a roadmap for themselves not to use. Those are the individuals who ultimately either don't get addicted at all, or if they have been addicted, they become sober and they remain sober.
And I want you to know something too. Dr. Gary Shadaghi is going to talk to us. In this program, we're going to cover solutions, steps. I mean, this is an addiction specialist we have here, so he's going to detail steps on how to get out of addiction. So if you're suffering from addiction, know somebody who's suffering from addiction, we're going to have those tips as well and tools for that, right?
Absolutely. And also there is a number of addictions, different types of addictions that exist beyond just alcohol and substance use. Substance use, whether it is illicit drugs or prescription drugs, is perhaps the number one addiction in the country and in the world. But we have other types of addiction. We have sex addiction. We have gaming and gambling addiction. We have online gaming.
Can you get addicted to like politics?
You can get addicted to almost anything. You can get addicted to Fox News. Right? You can get addicted to CNN. You can get addicted to Kardashians.
The Kardashians.
Right? You can get addicted to anything as long as you kind of feed that type of particular addiction. And in fact, workaholism as well, if you think about it, workaholism too, it can be regarded as a very much perfectionistic version of an almost, I would say, healthier addiction, even though it's not completely healthy, but it's more productive than any other type of addiction. People who bury themselves in their jobs, let's say 15 hours, 20 hours a day, and isolate themselves more or less from other areas that are important to them, such as family members, loved ones, neighbors, parties or functions that they ought to attend as like everybody else does, meaningful relationships, and that's completely are immersed in their daily work activity, they're addicted, more or less. And they will have a hard time to just drop this and not do it. If you ask them, they become stressed, they get agitated, and then they almost engage in the same or similar set of behaviors that addicts do when they are addicted to substances and alcohol and prescription meds, such as, let's say, they may lie about what they're doing. They become manipulative. They even may cheat or steal or do illegal stuff in order to get back to their the place where they come from.
That's really deep into the deep stage or a deep level of addiction.
Very deep level of addiction. Absolutely, that's the high dependence on that addiction. And that's one of the criteria of labeling someone dependent. They must have tried and failed. Just because someone is relying on something, let's say a person who went through surgery and they come out of the hospital, they're taking prescription medication for their pain, but they haven't tried yet to stop, right? So we don't know if they fail or not. We have to wait until we see that they actually attempt to stop using that medication, but can't. Like now, suddenly they go above and beyond the prescription dosage. And then they come and steal some medication from their parents or from somebody else because they are wanting to feed that craving. So yes, that's deep down into the depth of addiction. It can happen, and that is when a person really needs external sources of help, because internally they're just depleted. They cannot help themselves anymore.
We'll find out more about what that is. And I want to mention too, there's over $700 billion that costs society annually that's related to crime, loss of work productivity, as well as healthcare, all due to addiction. It's an amazing amount of money, almost $1 trillion annually. So let's get into, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about types.
Sure.
Types of addictions. You mentioned online gaming.
Yes.
You mentioned sexual addiction. We also talked about Fox News or whatever other news channel. Now, one question for you. Well, two questions, actually. There's a whole host of questions. Hang tight. People can get addicted even to good things. I've heard people can get addicted to 12-step addictions.
Right.
Now all of a sudden there's actually a 12-step for 12-step.
Right.
Is that possible?
It is possible. And that is, again, think about it. When we say they get addicted to a 12-step, what does that mean? They become dependent on those 12 steps. They become dependent on those groups. That means they lose the ability, or they have not yet learned the skills to remain an independently functional individual.
Can I explore that with you?
Sure.
So it sounds like the person is shackled.
Yes.
They're almost
Yes.
imprisoned with this dependency.
Absolutely.
So what goes through a person's mind like that? Because I know some of you who are suffering from addiction or have people who you know are addicted might see some of these symptoms because it feels like they don't have independence. Yeah. They're not free. Yeah. They're full of anxiety and fear. I mean, what's going on with these guys?
A lot. As you mentioned, these are just a few examples that you mentioned. I mean, we could go through, hours of information about what could go through people's minds because people are different. There's 7 billion people out there. Everybody goes through different things based on, something that is happening in their lives. But there are certainly most people who are addicted and dependent. They go through actually kind of, I would say, a dichotomous set of feelings. One is comfort because they're dependent. They depend highly on something. So that is how they comfort themselves. So to give you just that one example about the 12 step, if someone has learned that, okay, well, in order to keep my sobriety, all I need to do is to go to these meetings and every single day, and then suddenly they become highly dependent on it, where maybe if they didn't go to one meeting one day, they will become extremely and disproportionately anxious. And even the thought of them graduating from these 12-step meetings and functioning individually, moving on in their lives, would again make them highly anxious, or even moving from one city to another city. And then the fact that they would have to attend other types of 12 meetings in this new city would make them anxious because they're now so dependent on this other group that they're used to. Then if you put all this together, shows you these two different realities. One is this level of comfort that they now feel on a daily basis going to these 12-step meetings. So that's one thing that goes through a dependent person's mind.
Let me ask you that, because in psychology we always like, we got Freud's pain and pleasure theory.
Right.
But you're saying they're seeking comfort.
Yes.
And when we're looking for something, we are also running away from something.
Absolutely.
So what are they running away from? Is it uncomfortableness? What's the
yes, discomfort. So we always, human beings, you said it, whether it was expressed first by whoever, Freud or Jung or Piaget or whoever, it's a human principle that we run away, escape, avoid pain and discomfort, displeasure. And we seek comfort and pleasure and joy and happiness. That is just human nature. And beyond human nature, that's more or less actually organisms. Any live organism that exists in this world is functioning according to this principle, these two principles. Now, and that is, again, going back to what goes in addict's mind. They constantly want to stay away from things that upset them. And everybody has lots of things to upset them because nobody is perfect and nobody has a perfect life. We all have stress factors and stress points in our lives, whether it is a plan that we are struggling with, for instance, in the area of financial responsibility, or a relationship issue that we are dealing with, whether we have been rejected by someone, or we are hoping to enter into a relationship with someone else and we are anxious about that, or a discord in family dynamics, or a problem, a discord with a neighbor, the illegal issue that we are dealing with on the daily, a business problem that we are trying to solve, a career obstacle that we are trying to overcome, you name it. Every human being is struggling with some kind of a source of a stress or stressor for ourselves in our areas of life. So we tend to not want to deal with them. Either we want to quickly deal with them, get to a solution, or not deal with them at all. That is the principle of staying away from pain. And at the same time, we have aspirations, right? So we have these obstacles. Let's say in a career goal, for instance, I have to first get a degree before I can get a license and then practice psychology. But at the same time, it is aspiration of finally being a psychologist down the road and being able to help people or being, instrumental in someone's life and have some kind of a prestige and a financial status and so forth and so on, right? Those are the aspirations. So I'm looking forward to that, but staying away from the obstacles. Now, in a person who is not necessarily addicted to substances, to people, to other types of processes, again, those like sex or gambling or other processes that people can get involved in, then ultimately I will get to my goals despite these problems and obstacles. And I can also adapt easily. Let's say my situation changes. For instance, let's say my school, I'm going to a certain school, but I find out that because of my job, I have to transfer to another city, so I have to transfer my school. I can easily adapt. I'm not so dependent on that school. I'm not so dependent on that, on the peers and cohort that I have in that city. I can easily adapt, so I'm not that dependent. I don't go through withdrawals.
That's a healthy person.
That's a healthy person. An addict or an addicted personality or person would second guess that decision of moving to another city because they're highly dependent on this situation. Even though equal opportunity exists for them in the new situation, they do not want to adapt. There's too much pain involved.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
And the reason of fear, it varies among everybody, because it could be a reason of, it could be fear of uncertainty, fear of loss or abandonment where you're leaving. So it just depends on what it is for that person specifically.
Exactly. And where they come from, what kinds of emotional, intellectual, behavioral, relational, even spiritual difficulties they are dealing with. And sometimes in layman terms, we call that almost like demons, right? Everybody has their own demons. Well, what do we mean by demons? Basically, everybody has their own unique set of difficulties. For me, let's say it may be relationships, issues in relationships. But for you, it may be, no, you're fine in all your relationships. You don't worry about those. They're fine. You're kind of sailing through smoothly. But when it comes to let's say financial, planning, that is what preoccupies your mind, right? So when we are talking about, when you said these fears, well, it depends what kind of fears. I may have fears in relationships and losing someone, in getting close to someone. For instance, fear of intimacy is going to keep me from establishing good relationships, right? But you don't have that. You may not have that type of fear. You may have fear of, let's say, financial dependability on others. So in your decision making, you're going to be operating from that fear of, let's say, financial dependence. But in my decision making, I may be operating from fear of intimacy.
Question pops up in my head. So we have the fear of intimacy, fear of financial dependence, fear of whatever it may be.
Yeah.
That kind of, this is back to people out there who may know somebody or even yourself, that kind of alters your perception of what you're seeing, your reality, doesn't it?
It does.
Because if you have fear of finances,
yes,
that's going to make you more anxious.
Yeah.
Things are going to be exaggerated or minimized depending on what you're looking at, how you're looking at it. Your intimacy is the same thing.
Right.
And a lot of these things seem to stem from youth.
Well, it stems from events and memories, whether it is youth or not. I would say it stems from experience. Let's say if I have not dealt with any snakes in my life, right? Then I generally have fear, most likely will have fear of snakes if I see someone, because that's more of a genetic predisposition that a lot of organisms in the world, including human beings, have fear of snakes, because that's a survival value from an evolutionary perspective. But besides that, whether I'm 5-year-old or 50-year-old, if I come to that event where I'm exposed to a snake, depends what happens in that event. Like if I may go to a pet store and there is a snake in an aquarium, right? And then I kind of look at it, and they may even open the lid, and I might just look at it again, and they say, okay, it's safe to touch it. I may touch it or even put it on my body, and nothing happens. So there's really no fear per se developing that would become debilitating down the road. But let's say if I'm taking a hike down, up somewhere, mountain, and then I suddenly hear this hissing sound, and there's a snake that is charging me, and I run away, even without being bitten, then I have an event and memory that is traumatic. So that fear now is a fear that may also determine what will happen in my future. For instance, if I'm going to make a decision to go hiking again or not, I may deal with that fear in a different way. I may go to, basically some kind of a therapy, or I may just not even care about that and think of, okay, next time what I'm going to have is I'm going to take my gun with me, shoot that snake, or I may just take some protective gears with me, or I may take a cell phone or camera and say, okay, I'm going to take a picture, one of those GoPros, right? That just, just video. I'm just going to video whatever I see, and then if something happens to me, call 911, say this is the snake that bit me. So there are different ways I can deal with that fear, or go with a companion who would be able to help me in that situation. So there's many different ways I can deal with that fear, right? So it's not necessarily fear from that developed in the childhood. It can be any fear that develops from any event at any given time.
You could have venison for dinner, I guess.
Absolutely.
So on the territory of types, we're going to go into detail of all the different types of addiction. We're just kind of glossing over them. But I'm looking for some of the unique ones too, and one of them can fool us.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is positive uses of addiction. Somebody you mentioned earlier, a workaholic. Well, what about a CEO? A CEO, for instance, not every CEO, of course, but a CEO who's working 70, 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
Or a celebrity who's just addicted to fame. Has to be out in the limelight all the time. Can you somehow, I don't want to say use the addiction positively, but it's construed positively by the world because it looks like this guy's got it together or this woman's got it together, but in reality, it's an addiction that they have. Is that possible?
It is possible, and I would really, the proof is in the pudding, and I think the pudding I'm talking about is the pudding we eat at the time of deathbed. When we are in our deathbed, you got to ask a human being, what do you regret most? If somebody goes back and say, well, I had all this fame, it was wonderful, fantastic, and I had a beautiful life and had a great family, and I'm proud of this and that. And there was no impaired functioning in their lives, right? They didn't get DUIs, they didn't get multiple divorces, they didn't become violent, they didn't end up in jail, they didn't cheat and steal and lie and basically become antisocial, if you will. They didn't hurt themselves or others, in a very predictable, repeated pattern that couldn't have been stopped. Then fame by itself, an addiction to fame, is not a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing for them. You ask them at that deathbed and they say, "What was it bad for you?" Right? What would you regret? I think ultimately there's some subjectivity to every, aspect of this. At least our attempted assessment or objective assessment of addiction, because we can't really be 100% objective, right? We can try to be very objective. There's always some subjective value to it. But generally, if you no matter who it is who at their deathbed says, these are the things I have done, they always regret something. And some of those regrets, it comes back to extreme behaviors that they have engaged in. Some of it could be, I was just chasing fame and not paying attention to the rest of my life. So I missed out on a lot of other things that I could have been doing, and I didn't, right? There could be an example that can relate to fame. But most of the time, I think that people do regret, even before their deathbed, it comes to these other types of addictions that are obvious. They're obviously dysfunctional and impairing, such as substance use. Right? That's just obvious. I mean, you don't need 50 decades or 5 decades, 50 years of proof to show someone that they're destroying themselves. After a few years of doing heroin, you're done. You're just not functional. Or meth, it just eats away on our body. Meth is crazy. And marijuana too. Yes, there's medical marijuana discussion, anti-cancer discussion, anti-anxiety, all those type of things. But again, it comes down to research shows that prolonged use of any of these consciousness altering substances, whether it is in a legal or illegal form, is detrimental to our health. It lowers our capacity of functioning. If we are not at our 100% of capacity of our functioning. So ultimately, any of these addictive behaviors are detrimental, and the proof is in the impaired functioning we see.
That's the objective measure.
That's the objective measurement.
You're using impaired functioning, and it's a couple of areas, right?
Well, generally impaired functioning in 4 or 5 major areas. One is certainly biological. Impaired functioning when we see like meth is eating away gum and teeth and nerves and, killing brain cells. So that's biologically proven to be impaired functioning. Very simple. Then we have cognitive, emotional, behavioral functioning, against stealing, cheating, lying, not making good decisions, making awful decisions in life, developing hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, anger and violence toward others. That's all in the realm of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning. That's impairments. Then we have legal issues. People get in trouble with the law, with the society, because they have broken rules and laws, right? And that follows their addictive behaviors, their attempt at stopping their addiction that hasn't led anywhere. Then you have relational component. In relationships break down, divorce, separation, isolation, death, loss, all of those, right? That's another area of functioning. And then you can take it even further. You can talk about, for instance, career, losing one's job, having to relocate, if you will, financial, if you will. That's also an impairment. So at least in 5 areas, impairment can become obvious after a short while.
That's a great objective measure, though. That really helps.
Yes.
Like the other example we saw with, a person maybe is addicted to work or whatnot.
Right.
If you see any of those areas being impaired, then you have something to look out for.
Then you have something to look out for. And that's also important for family members to be able to have some material for argument's sake, if you will, because a lot of people who are in the trenches, in the throes of their addiction, and they're completely overwhelmed and debilitated, their reasoning is debilitated, then they ultimately engage in disconnection. They want to stay away from people, from family members, and there is no reasoning with them. But one thing we can use to help them is, first of all, an assessment. We can talk about this later in another tips and tools episode, but we have to do a thorough assessment, and we can start with these 5 areas of functioning to see how debilitating this problem is in a person that we love.
And that's why we have tools and tips. It's here to help you to be able to find answers. Those questions that you've been wondering about, maybe you didn't even know what questions to ask. We're going to try to provide those answers for you.
Fantastic. Thank you for listening.
Catch you next time.